for the perfume of your body, soul, and
What you have just heard, listeners all over the world, is a warning. And you will hear this warning from here on out. You've been listening to your leaders tell you that there's a great move toward democracy in the world. You witnessed the parting of the Iron Curtain, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the fracturing of the Soviet Union. And this is all supposedly toward a new worldwide democracy. Democracy is a code word for socialism, and that's why our forefathers established a republic. But don't get down, folks. All is not lost. The problem lies within each and every one of you, and therein also lies the answer. I'm your host, William Cooper, and you're listening to the Hour of the Time.
I'm coming back.
A historic nuclear agreement between the U.S. and Russia is on the brink of collapse. The U.S. has accused Russia of cheating on the treaty, and Moscow, denying those claims, has raised the prospect of an arms race if the U.S. withdraws. Friday, the U.S. announced it intends to trigger the withdrawal process, which is expected to last about 6 months.
Countries must be held accountable when they break the rules.
We'll get to why this 3 decades-old deal is suddenly in jeopardy. But first, here's what you need to know about the nuclear pact itself. The Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, also known as the INF Treaty, was signed by President Ronald Reagan and Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev in 1987. It banned land-based missiles capable of flying 300 to 3,400 miles, weapons that could deal a fatal and surprising blow with their quick flight times.
What we're talking about here are short and intermediate range missiles, right? So we're talking about real hits between, real cities that are very close to each other. By May 1991, there was 2,700 missiles that were destroyed.
The INF Treaty was hailed as a landmark agreement that signaled the end of the Cold War.
On several occasions, I've said that nations do not distrust each other because they're armed. They are armed because they distrust each other.
So why, after more than 30 years, is the deal suddenly on the brink of collapse? Since 2014, the U.S. has accused Russia of violating the agreement. President Obama brought the issue up with Russian President Vladimir Putin, but talks didn't really go anywhere. Then, as Russia's missile program progressed, the Trump administration took a more aggressive stance.
Today we must confront Russian cheating on its arms control obligations.
Back in December, the U.S. formally threatened to pull out of the treaty, and it gave Russia 2 months to comply with the pact. Moscow denies cheating, and Russian officials have accused the U.S. of using trumped-up charges in order to get out of the deal. So far, neither country is taking the other at its word. The dispute centers around this weapon, the 9M729 missile. Both the Obama and Trump administrations say the missile has been tested at a distance that violates the treaty, but Russia denies the charge. Aiming to prove that the missile is not in violation of the deal, Russia recently rolled out the weapon and released its specifications. The U.S. said none of the Russian proposals were verifiable, and that the only way Moscow could come into compliance was by destroying the missiles and their launchers. Russia says that if the U.S. pulls out of the treaty on February 2nd, as it has promised, it could prompt an arms race. But the U.S. says the treaty is not effectively constraining Russia, and that Moscow already has nearly 100 missiles.
What happens next lies in the hands of both the leaders. I mean, if the U.S. is indeed pursuing R&D into the kind of missiles that would be prohibited under the treaty, follows through with producing them, Putin has promised the same.
Beyond Russia and the U.S., there could be consequences for Europe, since European countries would be most threatened by Russian cruise missiles. And countries like China, which already have intermediate-range missiles, could see the United States place weapons closer to their borders.
The greatest threat the United States now faces is the Soviet Union.
Hello?
The Americans have no intelligence.
Undercover agents hiding all over the U.S. No one has any idea who they are. Well, they look like us. They speak better English than we do. Maybe there's another way.
I would lose everything before I would betray my country.
You're my wife.
Is that right?
The Americans premieres January only on FX.
Alrighty, you never, ever know about the NWO. Deep behind enemy lines of the New World Order for May the 17th, 2020. Well, I thought I would jump in here, and I just brought you up to speed on the Small Arms Trade Treaty. Senator Rand Paul emailed me today that the United Nations Small Arms Treaty has been the gun lobby's crown jewel for decades. They're not giving up just because President Trump announced his opposition. In fact, they plan to force it into law regardless of who's in the White House. You and I have a chance to stop them cold if you'll agree to take immediate action to help the president kill this dangerous treaty. Signed, the Honorable Rand Paul, U.S. Senator of Kentucky. So, exclusive news sent to me from Senator Rand Paul. I didn't find it out from nowhere else. Haven't heard it in the news. Nobody has reported it. So I thought I would make this news video as proof and as being first to those who saw it here first on my channel. Dr. Rand Paul introduced resolution to remove United Arms Trade Treaty from the U.S. Senate on Friday, his immediate press release. Over the weekend, you never know, last Monday, U.S. Senator Rand Paul introduced Senate Resolution 204 to remove the United Nations Arms Treaty from the United States Senate consideration and return it to the President for his approval. Last month, President Trump announced his decision to revoke the U.S. 2013 signature on the treaty. Shortly after his announcement, President Trump sent a message to the Senate requesting it return to the Arms Trade Treaty, which the Obama administration had submitted to it in the closing weeks of the 114th Congress in 2016 for ratification. So, as you see, Dr. Paul has now introduced a legislation to protect American Second Amendment rights. This treaty, as you can see below, has been sent to the Senate. And what does it mean? What does the United Nations Small Arms Treaty really mean? Okay. Here's proof that it's at Congress.gov.
There's one summary for SRS 204. Bill summaries are authored by CRS. Shown here, introduced in Senate, May 13, 2019. This executive resolution returns the Arms Trade Treaty to the President. The President requested such a return after concluding that the United States shall not become a party to the treaty. The United States had previously signed the treaty, but it had not been ratified by the Senate.
Okay, what does it all mean? What does the United Nations Arms Treaty mean? Well, from what I've studied and tried to alert people on, was the fact that the document drafted back in the early 60s called Freedom from War outlined a three-step process. And this process was to use the United Nations to elevate it to world government powers and have a military that could not be challenged by any country. Yes, sirree, a three-step process for total disarmament. That means us Americans that have been paranoid are justified so because these measures have been in effect and under Obama could have been possible as the third stage could have been implemented. And second of all, the goals of the United Nations, as you see, to secure this treaty and objectives, well, won't load for me now. But anyhow, it is simply the first stage would reduce the arms of every nation, and the nuclear arms would be reduced down to zero. So we would be prohibited from making nuclear arms. Well, unfortunately, the Soviet Union, as you know, did not abide by these treaties, and President Trump called them on their bluff and now took immediate actions to arrange, a banning of such law of gun control for us. So you see, international law and these agreements, which were going to be rammed down our throats if we had somebody that's, loyal to the United Nations Charter. And a second stage contains a series of measures bringing it inside of a world in which there would be freedom from war. And furthermore, there would be the prohibition of armed forces, the prohibition of military establishments of states, and the prohibition of military and militias and people with weapons to protect themselves. So the establishment of the United Nations internal peacekeeping force would be established, and foreign troops would be put on American soil. And us conspiracy nuts were well out of our bounds, trying to warn you ahead of time as they dismantled the nuclear weapons at our military bases to do the second stage process. Okay? That's what this is all about in Rand Paul. During the third stage of this program, building experience upon a United Nations peace force. Yee-haw! Yeah! Isn't that what we all want to see? A United Nations peace force. And that's something that I don't think it settles very well with many gun-toting Americans, because they know that we know that the Chinese and the Soviet Union troops were going to be used as part of their plan of world government in the future. It's quite scary knowing that blue helmets and freedom from war all fits in this United Nations State Department document 7277. Look it up. Disarmament shall take place as rapidly as possible in these stages, balance forward in the disarmament obligations, and so on and so forth. And to reduce in 3 steps the United States military, their nuclear weapons. The Soviet Union didn't go along with it, and now let's the vehicle for promoting a resolution for the United States President, yeah, to remove the United Nations Small Arms Treaty from ever being ratified. We can cheer here today. Senator Rand Paul, yes sirree, we can cheer today Senator Rand Paul's wonderful attempt to protect America from a United Nations peacekeeping force gun-grabbing invasion. Besides the fact we know that Friday he spoke on the Senate floor on the spying techniques by our government trying to kick the president out of office and using the FISA Patriot Act to spy on Americans.
That liberty can be exchanged for security. The history of the Patriot Act shows that the exchange is a poor one. As our liberty wanes and wastes away, we find that the promises of security were an illusion. The history of the Patriot Act is really a history of how power corrupts and how bias and malfeasance grow when power is unchecked. The Patriot Act allows a secret court, FISA, to grant generalized warrants to collect personal data from millions of Americans. The spies who run these surveillance programs then lied for years and years to us. One of the most notorious of these liars was James Clapper. When cross-examined under oath by Senator Wyden, James Clapper denied that the government was collecting data on millions of Americans. A month later, the whistleblower, Edward Snowden, revealed that Clapper had lied. Snowden revealed that Clapper and others were using the Patriot Act to spy on virtually every American. Snowden revealed that the secret FISA court was allowing a single court order to command the collection of millions of Americans' personal phone data. Most members of Congress had no idea that this was going on. In fact, one of the authors of the Patriot Act publicly expressed his shock that such a massive surveillance of Americans was occurring with no notification of Congress. Clapper and others, though, said that's not true. They justified their actions by saying, we've been briefing the elite 8 congressmen. Who are the elite 8 and who made them elite? The elite 8 are the majority and minority leaders of the House and the Senate, and the majority and the minority leader of the Intelligence Committee in the House and the Senate. 8 people. When they were quizzed about this program, most of them said they couldn't remember ever being briefed on it. But the real constitutional question is, have we not changed and subverted the Constitution to make 8 people more important than the rest of us? So this is a program where they were collecting the data on everybody's phone calls, everybody in America, and you would think there would have to be a debate and approval by Congress, but they only take 8 people. And those 8 people seem to be confused that they had approved the program as well. The idea that a single court order can allow the collection of personal data from millions of people is antithetical to the intentions of the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment dictates that the government must identify an individual and the items and the location to be searched. The Fourth Amendment was intended to forbid general warrants or writs of assistance that historically monarchs had used indiscriminately to collect vast amounts of either belongings or possessions of individuals. The Fourth Amendment was written to prevent that from happening. The Patriot Act essentially allows for generalized warrants and the bulk collection of personal data. The Fourth Amendment also dictates that a search can only occur when you prove to a judge, when the government proves to a judge that there is probable cause that a crime has been committed. However, under the Patriot Act, they have lowered the standard. So there's the constitutional standard, the Fourth Amendment, but under the Patriot Act, the standard now becomes if it is relevant to an investigation. So that's a much looser, broader standard, and it's not a constitutional standard. So the question is, through these special secret courts and through the Patriot Act can we allow things that the Constitution actually prevents. What we've done is eroded protections for Americans. And so some of us have said the Constitution should still apply to Americans. If you want to look at the data of foreigners or spy on foreign countries or potential terrorists, by all means do it, but Americans still should be protected by the Constitution. The Patriot Act doesn't provide this protection and allows anybody to be investigated if the government can prove that it's relevant to an investigation. That standard is so broad that could mean almost anything. It's hard to imagine something that could not be argued to be relevant to an investigation. To those of us that prize the rights guaranteed in the Bill of Rights, the Patriot Act is a violation of our most precious rights. The Patriot Act in the end is not patriotic. The Patriot Act makes an unholy and unconstitutional exchange of liberty for a false sense of security. And I, for one, will oppose its reauthorization. Today we are also here, though, to discuss the FISA court that interacts and uses some of these extra powers, these extra constitutional powers. It has been revealed over the last few years that the FISA court was manipulated, lied to, and ultimately condoned the investigation of a political campaign. I believe that the authors of the FISA court, who intended to restrain unconstitutional searches, would be appalled at what the FISA court has become. They would be appalled that this secret court intended to be used to investigate foreign spies and terrorists was turned into a powerful and invasive force to infiltrate and disrupt the political process. It should not matter whether you are a Democrat or a Republican or a Libertarian. We should all be appalled at this abuse of power. The question is, how do we fix it? To my mind, there are two approaches. Number one, we could try to make the FISA court less bad by adding procedural hurdles to make it more like a constitutional court. Or number two, admit that the FISA court cannot be made constitutional. Admit that FISA uses a less than constitutional standard when it allows searches to be performed that do not meet the Fourth Amendment. The Fourth Amendment requires probable cause that you've either committed a crime or are committing a crime. The FISA court only says we have to say that there is probable cause, the government must prove or assert that there's probable cause that you're connected to a foreign government. But as we've seen, the standards were so lax that when they went to the Trump campaign and said that a certain person was related to a foreign government, it turns out it was untrue. And they didn't present facts to the court that actually argued that he wasn't an agent of the foreign government, and that person had no one to argue for him. The deficiency of the FISA court and why it's not constitutional is you don't get a lawyer. You actually don't even get told that you've been accused of a crime. The only reason we know that President Trump's campaign got caught up in this is he won. Because he won and now has the power to open and put sunlight on this, we are now able to see this. If this had been an ordinary American caught up in this, you would never be told. You would never get a lawyer, and you would have been brought before this investigative body and allowed to search vast amounts of your private information without probable cause. That is not constitutional, and I don't think we can make it constitutional. I think we should admit that we can't constitutionally allow Americans to be subjected to a search that doesn't follow the Fourth Amendment. I believe there's no fixing the FISA court to make it constitutional for Americans. I believe the only solution is to exempt Americans from the FISA court. If government wants to investigate a political campaign, which should be a very rare and a very unusual circumstance to have the government involved in a political campaign, government should request a Fourth Amendment search from an Article III constitutional court. Now, some will say, oh, it's so hard, we'll never get it. Guess what? Even constitutional warrants are mostly granted. The vast majority of them are granted, but guess what? A judge will be a little reticent to get involved in the political process because they know how heated it is and how important it is to our republic. But that's the way you should investigate a campaign if you're going to. Opponents of doing the tried and trusted constitutional way will argue that it takes too long, it's too hard. But guess what? The Constitution was meant to be an onerous standard. The Constitution was meant to be rigorous. Our founding fathers understood that justice cannot be achieved in secret courts that don't notify the accused, nor let the accused have legal representation. You can't find justice where there is no adversarial process, where you don't get a lawyer. I think it's high time we quit letting fear overrun our constitutional duty. So today I offer an amendment that restores the Constitution for all Americans and forbids the secret FISA court from ever again meddling in our political process. Mr. President, I call up my amendment 1586 and ask that it be reported by number.
The clerk will report. The clerk will report the amendment by
God bless the Republic.
Yes, to the New World Order.
We shall prevail, ladies and gentlemen. The empire is on the run.
And we are on the march, day and night.
Hoorah. Thank you, gentlemen. Guys, we'll be back at 8 o'clock. Meanwhile, BC coming up next. Don't you touch that dial, because we got a lot more live radio on Liberty Tree Radio.
Plant the seed in our home, and boys, let it grow where all can see. Feed it with our devotion, boys.